Good afternoon. All this week I've been talking about foreclosures, and really I've been talking about sort of regular residential mortgage foreclosures. Today I wanted to give you the basics of the second highest form of foreclosures in Texas, and those are property tax sales that happen when a government entity decides to go after your property for failing to pay property taxes. So we'll be going over that today. Welcome to another edition of Coffee with Law. My name is Benjamin Sanchez, and I represent consumers, tenants, and homeowners in everyday life setbacks to help them move forward. Thank you for joining me. So today I wanted to go over a little bit about property tax. Actually, the property tax uh, law is found in a different part of our legal codes. They're under the tax code as opposed to the property code because it's a special type of power that's given to the government as opposed to what we've been talking about so far, which was been basically the private right of a mortgage company to go after your property. And in fact, for property tax foreclosures, this involves a lawsuit in a government order as opposed to just a private taking. So the government can't come in and do what we call a non-judicial foreclosure, which is where they don't have to go to court, and that's what banks can do. The property, the government has to use the government system in order to get to this. So I want to go over some of the basics. There are a lot of things to cover in a property tax foreclosure that can be done, quite frankly, in a hour-long or more seminar that I can give to attorneys. But here I don't want to overwhelm you with a lot of detail. I want to give you some of the highlights about what the differences are. So the first one that is the one I've already told you is that instead of just giving notices and then being able to sell the property, when a government entity wants to potentially take your property and sell it, they first have to get a court order. That means that there is a lawsuit involved. Now, most of the time, your home is covered by multiple taxing entities. You have the city, the county, you have school districts, and not every single entity has to file their own separate suit. Usually, what happens is that there's one entity that sort of takes the lead, but under the law, all the other entities can join in. It sounds complicated, but quite frankly, it's a lot simpler because most of the time there's a one law firm that kind of knows all of the different entities, and they get all of their different tax statements and they put them all into the lawsuit, even though technically they may be hired by one entity to do that. Okay, so there's going to be a lawsuit for this. In the bigger counties, the county courts have the ability under the tax code to appoint tax masters. So instead of the tax lawsuits clogging up the docket of regular courts with all these tax lawsuits, here in Harris County, for example, they appoint tax masters, which are basically an extension of the court, and there are special judges who hear just these cases. And then they end up ruling and making a recommendation that then goes to the presiding judge of that court from which they were appointed, who will then either sign off on that recommended ruling or not. The homeowner does have the ability to appeal the decision of that tax master to the presiding judge, but it must be done under certain circumstances in a certain way. And again, the point is not to give you all the details today, but know that you have a quick right to appeal if you lose a hearing in front of a tax master that then gets to appeal, that you can appeal to the regular court. However, if you have a regular judge who is doing this without a tax master, then your regular rights of appeal will still be there if you want to appeal the presiding court's decision. I think what's really good to know about tax sales. So what happens is you get this order that comes down. Let's say you lose. There is an order that the judge says you can sell a taxing entity. You can sell this property. Now, the taxing entity has 6 months from that order to sell the property. If they don't, then that order basically goes away and they've got to do it over again. So they have to try to do it within 6 months. You do have the ability prior to the sale to pay off whatever that judgment is, which is going to include basically all of the fees, everything that they had to go through, the taxing entity had to go through in order um, to get that judgment. It may include attorney's fees, court costs, other things like that. Maybe there are certain appraisal costs or just all sorts of things that may have to go into it. But as long as the taxing entity has not sold the home based upon the order, you as the homeowner do have the right to go and pay it off, and then that judgment will be released by the taxing entity, so there will be no sale. So you definitely have the right to do that. Now, what happens if the sale actually takes place? This is the biggest thing that I think we need to know about property tax sales, is the right of redemption. And that is basically the ability you have to actually undo the sale within a certain amount of time after the sale has taken place. In Texas, it's basically 2 years. 2 years after the sale, you have the right, up to 2 years, you have the right to basically redeem the property, which is undo the sale. However, there is a cost to it. And depending upon who bought the property and how long ago the property was bought, there are different costs. So, for example, if the property was sold to not to the taxing entity, so remember we've talked about earlier in the week in the example of banks that sometimes not enough people show up and the bank ends up buying the property that the substitute trustee is selling. So basically it just stays with the bank. That can happen in a property tax foreclosure sale as well. But assuming that the property is sold to another individual or entity, someone who's not related to the taxing entity, then you have 2 years to purchase it. In doing so, you have to pay all of the money that was spent in getting this tax sale done, going through court, all those expenses, all those fees, the attorney's fees, collection costs, all of that stuff. If you do this within the first year after the order of sale, after the sale has been completed, not the order, but after the sale has been completed, then you also have to pay a 25% premium to the new owner who bought the property at that sale. So we call that a redemption fee. Under the law, it's called a premium, but you have to pay all of the costs plus 25% of all that on top of it to the owner in order for the owner to give that property back to you. Okay, so that has to be done. If you do it in the second year, that fee goes up to 50%. So again, there's basically a penalty or a premium for doing that. If you do that in the second year, then you pay all of those costs, plus you pay 50% to the new owner. So again, you do get your property back, but it comes at a cost. Let's see what else. Of course, all of the taxing entities will end up being paid whatever they can. Now, at the time that a lawsuit is filed for a tax sale, not only can the outstanding past due tax payments be included, but the taxing entities can also include the current year or estimate the current year that would become due during this lawsuit. Additionally, assuming that there are taxes that come due during the lawsuit that go past due, then at the time of the judgment, let's say they included years 2017 and 2018 and 2019, but then at the time of the judgment, 2020 taxes were due, then the judgment can include the 2020 taxes as well. Because the idea, obviously, is for the government to get all of the taxes that are due at that time. So the additional taxes can be included in that judgment. A couple of other things. Sometimes a property is abandoned, so no one is actually living at the property. The law says that there can be a seizure of that property, and then a litigation for the actual sale. In order for there to be a seizure of the property, there basically has to be a number of years that the taxes are due, for between 3 and 5. Usually it's 5, but between 3 and 5. And the property has to be abandoned for at least a year. So that's something that is a proof of evidence has to be given to the court as to that property being abandoned for at least a year. And again, the law goes into what the definition of abandoned means, but it does have to be abandoned. In my own work over the past 22 years, what I've seen most of the time is when a property is abandoned, basically when someone has died and either doesn't have any heirs to take it over, and so the property goes abandoned, or someone has died and the heirs just are too busy living their own lives to sort of deal with the property, right? So maybe they've dealt with it in probate, but they never actually paid the taxes. So no one's living on the property. Taxes have not been paid in several years, and the heirs have just never dealt with it. And I've had cases like that where the heirs have come to me long after the parents have died. And we've had to go through some property litigation regarding that type of situation. Oh, let's see here. In a tax suit, the taxing entity normally does not get an injunction. However, there are special times where if the taxing authority or their attorney thinks that you're about to try to sell that property or transfer that property to someone else without them getting paid, they can get an injunction from the court that basically denies the ability of the homeowner to transfer that property to someone else's name to sell that property without prior approval. So just because you're sued doesn't mean that you can go run off prior to the judgment, prior to the trial, and try to sell the property out from underneath the taxing authority just to get the money. You're definitely going to raise the ire of the court and potentially get an injunction against you for doing that. So if you want to sell the property because you think that you have a better chance of selling the property at a higher price than the taxing authority would at an auction, and I suggest most of the time that's the case, that you as a private owner would be able to sell the home for a higher price because auctions just don't tend to lead to very good values for the homeowners. That you work with the taxing authority and the attorney to allow you to get that sale done, even while the case is going on. but with the idea that part of what's going to happen at the closing is that all those property taxes are going to get paid. I guess the other thing I can tell you is this, that in a tax lawsuit, the taxing authority can, one, go for a foreclosure sale, ask the judge that, hey, we want to sell the property so that we can foreclose on the lien and sell the property so we can get our tax money. The taxing authority can also independently just say, you know what, that property is not worth anything, but we want to go after the homeowner for personal liability on the amount of taxes that are owed. So if there are $30,000 in taxes that have been built up, instead of going after the property, they can go after you because maybe the land is only worth $10,000, or they can do both. And quite frankly, the most the option that is done the most is quite frankly both. Right? They go after the foreclosure sale, plus they go after personal liability against the homeowner. So these are not cases that should be messed around with lightly. Again, you do not need an attorney to go into court in Texas. Quite frankly, in the U.S., you can represent yourself at all times, but your best chance is to hire an attorney who knows what they're doing, who knows their way around foreclosures, the tax code, and the property tax sales. The other thing, I guess the last thing I'll end this with this is that when we were talking about evictions, we talked about this idea of writ of possession. And that is that after so many days after a judgment is done, the court can issue a writ if you're not out of the property. And that writ is called a writ of possession. Okay, and as I discussed in evictions, usually that writ is entered 1 week after. So after a week, if you're not out, the landlord can get a writ of possession from the court to go have the constable kick you out. In property tax foreclosures, that writ is at least 20 days. So you have longer to move out after a property tax judgment. It's 20 days instead of the week that you would have in eviction. So those are really the big differences I just wanted to cover is that one, you need some sort of order of sale in a property tax code. Two is that you do have the right to redeem the property, whereas you don't really in a regular mortgage kind of non-judicial foreclosure. There's that right of redemption doesn't exist. The right of redemption also exists in the HOA sale, and I'll get to that in another video. But you have the right to redeem, but the longer you wait to exercise that right to redeem, the more expensive it gets. The least amount of expense will be to pay that judgment before the sale takes place. But you generally have up to 2 years after the sale in order to redeem the property, assuming that you pay for everything. And you have a little bit longer to get out of the property should you lose and you don't want to contest this. I hope this has been helpful. I did skip yesterday because of a lot of work. That means that tomorrow I'm going to be discussing the protections that are being afforded to foreclosures. I know that's a Saturday, but I wanted to make sure I gave enough time for that because, quite frankly, what I'm going to do tomorrow, guys, is I'm going to start the video at 8:30 in the morning, and I'm actually going to open it up to questions and answers via comments on Facebook. So if you want to ask me some questions regarding foreclosures and the COVID protections that are going on, I will do my best to answer them or point you in the right direction of where we can get answers, or I'll take the questions, and try to get answers and put those answers into a later video. So tomorrow morning, Saturday, 8:30, is going to be my special foreclosure COVID protections live stream, in which I will definitely be looking at the comments while we're going on. and try to have some questions and answers regarding that. It'll be a longer video than my typical 5 to 15-minute videos that I've been doing, but I think it'll prove fruitful for everyone because I know there's a ton of questions about what is and what is not going on regarding foreclosures. All right. So thank you for joining me today regarding property tax foreclosures in Texas. Thank you for staying tuned to another edition of Coffee with Law. Again, I'm Benjamin Sanchez. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great night. Bye-bye.